Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing of the U.S. news media. The news media also is inexplicably hostile towards Russia. If the current warmongering against Russian Christians is in any way motivated by the same ethnic hatred that motivated the Holodomor, we must face that truth honestly. So here's my question. If Jewish individuals hated Christian Ukrainians enough to starve millions of them to death, could the same thing happen today? Could Jewish individuals use a position of power to seek out revenge against places like Europe and Russia that have a history of expelling Jews? Thank you again for your work. Just remember Rule 9, you know, it's like, maybe there's something here that you don't know about, you know? And I am trying to just speak the truth.
Okay. Just a tangle that issue that is so difficult to disentangle. First of all, I haven't read this book, and I do want to read the book. So thank you for giving me the book.
You're welcome.
I can't do it.
That's okay. Thank you very much for your work. You really have changed my life. You changed the life of a lot of people. Thank you so much.
I can't do it.
That's okay.
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 This is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. So I'm hesitant to broach the topic. But I'll tell you one thing that I did in the last week that's relevant to this. And this just shows you how complex the problem is. First of all, we should point out that race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. And that's a big problem from a scientific perspective. But we'll leave that aside. And I wrote an article this week. Somebody stood up at one point in one of my talks, and Vice, bless their hearts, took this particular question and used it as an indication of the quality of the people who are my so-called followers. And by the way, the quality of my so-called followers is pretty damn high. And you can find that out quite rapidly just by looking at the YouTube comments, which are head and shoulders above the standard set of YouTube comments, I can tell you that. So someone asked me about the Jewish question, right? And the implication, it was actually someone Jewish, and the implication was that Jews are overrepresented in positions of authority and power. And I had just spoken for like an hour and a half, and you know, this guy had an axe to grind, and I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm getting into this at the moment. And so I said I can't answer that question. But that's not a very good answer. So I wrote a blog post this week, and I said, look, here's the situation. All right. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then let's open our eyes a little bit, eh? And think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us. So let's not confuse competence with power and authority, even though that's a favorite trick of the radical leftists who always fail to make that distinction. Well, why does this overrepresentation occur? Because it does. There's also overrepresentation in political movements, including radical political movements. Okay, why? Well, answer 1, Jewish conspiracy. Okay, that's not a very good answer. We've used that answer before. All right, but do we have an alternative? Well, here's an alternative. The average Ashkenazi IQ is somewhere between 110 and 115, which is about 1 standard deviation above the population average. And so what that means is that the average Ashkenazi / European Jew has an IQ that's higher than 85% of the population. That's a lot higher. Now, that doesn't make that much difference in the middle of the distribution, okay? But geniuses don't exist at the middle of the distribution. They exist at the tails of the distribution. And you don't need much of a move at the mean to produce walloping differences at the tails. And the tails are important because a lot of where we draw exceptional people from the exceptions, right? So here's another example of the same thing. Most engineers are male. Why? Because men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And you might say, well, that's sociocultural. It's like, no, it's not. And we know that because if you stack up countries by their egalitarian social policies, which you can do quite effectively, and then you look at the overrepresentation of men in STEM fields, the overrepresentation increases as the countries become more egalitarian. So it's not sociocultural. Okay, now men aren't that much more interested in things than women. It's one standard deviation, which is about the same difference, by the way, between the population norm and the Ashkenazi Jews. But if you're looking at the one person in 20 or the one person in 50 who's hyper interested in things and thus likely to become an engineer, then most of them are men. Here's another example of the same thing. Men are more aggressive than women. Now, you might ask, how much? And the answer to that is, best place to look at that is in Sweden, where the egalitarian policies have been laid out for a long period of time, and you can get a more direct inference about biology. If you took a random man and a random woman out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So that's not that much, right? It deviates from 50-50, but it's not like 90-10, it's 60-40. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we got a tail problem here again. Let's say that now you decide to go out onto the extremes of aggression and you identify the most aggressive 1 in 100 persons. They're all men. Guess who's in prison? Those people. That's why most of the people in prison are men. And so this is elementary. Part of the problem in our society is that we don't understand statistics. We don't understand that you can have relatively small differences at the population level that produce walloping consequences at the tails of the distribution. Okay, so back to IQ. One final thing to say about IQ. The ethnic differences are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away. You can say, well, the tests aren't culture fair. Well, here's a test of that. So imagine you test group A with an IQ test and you test group B with an IQ test, and then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting. If the test was biased against ethnic group A, then it would underpredict their performance, and that doesn't happen. Now you could say, well, there's systemic bias in the performance measures and the potential measures, and that's a possibility. All right. Now, one other thing about that. There's a real danger in the ethnicity IQ debate, and the danger is that we confuse intelligence with value, or that we confuse intelligence with human value. That's a better way of thinking about it. And one of the things that we're going to have to understand here is that that's a mistake, is that being more intelligent doesn't make you a better person. That's not the case. It makes you more useful for complex cognitive operations, but you can be pretty damn horrific as a genius son of a bitch, right? It's morally neutral, and we also know that from the psychometric data, by the way. There doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. And so if it does turn out that nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is highly probable, we shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that if group A or person A is lower on one of these attributes than group B or person B, that is somehow reflective of their intrinsic value as human beings. That's a big mistake.